Okay, so let's get going with affirming the faith of those outside the faith. We heard a hint of it when it was revealed that Abimelech, the pagan king, demonstrated a greater reverence for God and obedience to God's commands than did Abraham, the father of faith. And you remember the story. Abraham and Sarah ventured into the kingdom of Gerar, fearing that he would be killed because of his attractive wife. Abraham passed Sarah off as his sister, whereupon Abimelech added her to his harem. But before her virtue could be compromised, God appeared to Abimelech in a dream, warning him that Sarah was a married woman. Abimelech protested his innocence, and God readily conceded that he was innocent, whereupon Sarah was immediately returned to Abraham, who was thoroughly and appropriately chastised by Abimelech. You have done things to me that ought not to be done. What were you thinking of that you did this thing? And you remember Abraham's lame reply, I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Now, as we observed when dealing with that story, those who are not numbered among the covenant people of God sometimes behave with greater integrity than those who are. That is a sobering fact which ought to be instructive for you and me. But here's the deeper issue, which was so vexing for Israel and which is no less troubling for the church. God has a special relationship with those who know his name and do his will. However, it is clear enough that sometimes God reveals himself to those who do not know his name or seek to do his will, and that they often respond to that revelation in faithful obedience. We see that in Abimelech and even more dramatically in Hagar. So let me sharpen the issue. Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Well, that is certainly plain enough, perfectly straightforward. Yet where does that leave the Jew, the Muslim, the Hindu, the Buddhist, and countless others who do not acknowledge the Lordship of Jesus Christ, and yet who have and practice a deep and exemplary piety? There's the matter in front of us tonight. How do we affirm the faith of those who are outside the faith without compromising our conviction that the fullness of God is revealed uniquely and definitively in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ? The sad tale of Sarah and Hagar is one of the better known in the Old Testament. Here's the way one commentator rather antiseptically summarized it. In contemporary terms, this text reveals a highly dysfunctional family system in which individuals, both male and female, are caught up in swirls of dissension beyond their own making or ability to control. The pen of another was a bit more imaginative. In these few verses, the laconic storyteller does a thorough hatchet job on the father and mother of God's chosen people. It is worthy of Jane Austen at her most savage. It should make us think with some trepidation about the kind of people God works his wonders on, and that, among others, means ourselves. The story is of the sort Andrew Greeley had in mind when he observed that God draws straight. with crooked lines. Dysfunctional, yes, without a doubt, but for good enough reason, it seems to me. For more than a decade, they had been tantalized by a promise which was too good to be true when it was made the first time, let alone all these years later. There is anguish in this, the anguish of those called to faith in God, the fulfillment of whose promises tarries too long. For the first time in this long saga, Sarah becomes a person in her own right, and not only a person, but also a theologian. To Abraham, she said, "You see that the Lord has prevented me from having children." Now, whether or not that is accurate, it is consistent with the biblical understanding that children are the gift of God. The children she had not been given, but there was a legitimate way around it. "Go in to Hagar, my slave girl. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." Now, that arrangement, I hasten to tell you, was perfectly legal at the time. A child born to a wife's personal maid could be considered the wife's own child. Therefore, morality is not the issue, but rather faith. In that regard, most commentators are hard on Sarah, and Abraham as well, interpreting this proposal as another act of their unfaith, taking the promise into their own hands, unwilling to wait for God to work his inscrutable purpose. Calvin described their faith as defective, but that was easy enough for him to say. They were called to persist in believing against all common sense. In scene 2 of this first act, Hagar has conceived, but has also refused to play the subservient role expected of her. She interpreted her pregnancy as a triumph over Sarah with predictable results. This is what the proverbist wrote: "Under 3 things, the earth trembles. Under 4, it cannot bear up: a slave when he becomes a king, a fool when glutted with food, an unloved woman when she gets a husband, and a maid when she succeeds her mistress." Sarah's anger was fully justified, as was her sharp rebuke of Abraham, whose responsibility it was as head of the family to put a stop to such unbecoming behavior. But he wanted no part of this dispute and shifted it back to Sarah, giving her the authority to do as she pleased, with no apparent regard for the effect on Hagar. As one disgusted commentator put it, Abraham allowed this pregnant girl, a stranger in a strange land, whose status and that of her unborn child depended entirely on his whim, who had not long since bedded Hagar, and whose only fault had been a little pardonable bragging, to be driven from his home. It was a craven display of cowardice, far worse than what he had shown in Egypt. Well, God draws straight with crooked lines, and they're about to get crookeder. For all her spunkiness, however unprudential, we must not ignore Hagar's complete vulnerability. She had no choice but to become a surrogate mother. She had no powers or rights or process of appeal beyond the waffling Abraham, should she be mistreated. As an Egyptian, she was an outsider, an African, who was certain, ironically, that she would find more freedom and respect in Egypt than among God's chosen people. So she took matters into her own hands and fled. In the wilderness, by a spring of water, there appeared to this outcast no less than God in human form. Now that is the first surprise, and a stunning one it was to the early hearers of this story. Yeah, I know the text says angel, but the word angel simply means messenger. And in that messenger, Hagar recognized God in human form. There's the second surprise, and more stunning than the first. But there's a third. God blessed Hagar and the child in her womb. I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude. Now you have conceived and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction. Ishmael means God hears, so named because God heard her cries in the wilderness. He will be a Bedouin, a wild ass of a man, a worthy son of his proud and rebellious mother. And here is the fourth surprise. So Abraham named the Lord who spoke to her. You are Elroy, she said. Have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him? From time to time, God names himself. Indeed, it's his right to do so and alone to do so. But Hagar is the only human being in the whole of the Old Testament to name God. You are Elroy, the God who sees me. And with that, Hagar, as powerless and marginalized as anyone could possibly be, blessed by God, but never to be numbered among God's chosen people, is nevertheless revealed to be a person of great faith, willing to trust and to wait for the fulfillment of God's promise to her. Self-satisfied Israel could not have missed the point of this remarkable story, that God has not exclusively committed himself to Abraham and Sarah. God's concern is not confined to the elect line. His love and mercy are offered no less to those outside the community of faith who often respond to God with reverence and obedience. Affirming the faith of those outside the faith. Now, there was the problem for Israel, and it is an even greater problem for the church. Jesus said, all things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. When the Jewish authorities demanded to know by what power or name Peter and John healed the lame man, Peter replied, by the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, whom you crucified, whom God raised from the dead. There is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among mortals by which we must be saved. I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Now look, here's where the weeds get thick. So hang on and work at this with me. I'll try to summarize it at the end and see what you make of it. Because mind you, I'm having as much trouble, always have had, as many of you have, with the way in which these texts read absolutely out of a relationship with God or appear to anyone who does not claim the name of Jesus. So it's a mutual struggle, and we'll have time to work it over at the end. Typically, Christians deal with texts like those I just quoted in one of three ways: exclusivism, pluralism, and inclusivism. Exclusivism says there is no other name, way, or truth, period. Christianity is the only true religion, and all others are substantially false. Pluralism says that for us Christians, Jesus is surely the way and the truth and the life, but there are also other paths to God. Jesus is one way, but not the only way. Beneath everything that distinguishes the religions of the world, there is a common faith in one God who is seemingly present and work in them all. The thoughtful pluralist does not mean thereby that each religion is equally true. There are those, including some versions of Christianity, that are superstitious, personally destructive, and socially oppressive. But wherever one encounters a religion that acknowledges a loving and a just transcendence that gives direction to human life, promotes wholeness, maintains high ethical standards, and contributes to the liberation of people, there is a true and valid religion, whether its followers call on the name of Jesus or Muhammad or Moses or the Buddha or some other name entirely. That's pluralism. Inclusivism says that Christianity is the true, unique, and definitive religion, but that God's grace is also at work outside the Christian circle, enabling non-Christians to be genuinely religious and ethically responsible. Not only Christians, therefore, but also those who live in light of the best and most authentic religious faith that is available to them will be saved. Karl Rahner, the Roman Catholic theologian, dares to call such people anonymous Christians. Now, I know that many of you are not happy with exclusivism, and you probably know that I'm not at all happy with pluralism, which leaves open the via media of inclusivism. However, that strikes me as being analogous to kissing your sister. I had no idea where to go with this, and have not had, until I eagerly came upon an insightful essay by Professor Shirley Guthrie. Now, you have heard Johnny Cash sing about a boy named Sue. I hope you have. Well, this is a man named Shirley, a Presbyterian theologian who was on the faculty of Columbia Presbyterian Seminary in Georgia. Apparently, he wasn't happy with any of the above either, and set out to articulate a fourth way of affirming the faith of those outside the faith. Now, I think once you see this in print, you won't find it so complicated, but just listening to it, it may be. So let's work through what he said and see if it makes sense to us.
Jack, would you like me to screen share the document so people can see it?
Well, I don't know whether that's helpful or not. You tell me.
Just give me a
You're
second.
the boss.
I can pull it up and screen share it. So you keep talking and I'll get it
Well,
up.
all right. Guthrie contends that we must make a clear distinction between the gospel of Jesus Christ and the Christian religion. To be a Christian is to exalt and glorify Jesus Christ and not Christianity, which at its purest is nevertheless a human interpretation of the gospel. The question then is not what is Christianity, but rather who is this Jesus whom Christians confess to be the way and the truth and the life, in whose name alone salvation is to be found. Sarah, that's not it. That's part of your Sunday bulletin.
No, this should be Shirley Guthrie. Are you not seeing Shirley Guthrie?
No, I'm seeing him come to the table.
Oh, well, that is not what it says it's sharing. Interesting.
Right.
I will
Let's
close-
let's just let it go, and maybe if by the end you can find it, we can go back and review. So again, don't miss this connection that Guthrie tries to make. And what you need to decide all the way through here is this really profoundly insightful, or is it sleight of hand? So he wants to distinguish between, there it is, between Christ and Christianity, which at its purest is nevertheless a human interpretation of the gospel. Question then is not what is Christianity, but rather who is this Jesus whom Christians confess to be the way and the truth and the life, in whose name alone salvation is found. Well, he is the one in whom is revealed the will and work of the God who created the heavens and the earth, who is the giver and defender of the life and well-being of all creatures on the planet, who governs history through his providence, preserving freedom and justice in human society, whom Abraham and Sarah and Hagar all knew and obeyed long before there were such things as Christians. Clearly enough, God as creator and sustainer is recognized outside the Christian circle. People who are not Christians, nevertheless, some at least, acknowledge God as creator and sustainer. We may gratefully affirm the presence of work of God wherever and among whomever, whether Christians or not, physical and material life is treated with respect and used responsibly. We're talking about animals, land, plants, and so on. On the other hand, wherever and among whomever there is contempt for any part of the created order, when natural resources are exploited for some at the expense of others, there is exposed a lack of faith in, if not opposition to, the God we know in Jesus Christ, who created the world and called it good. Now, essentially what he's doing, before I go on, he is saying that if we recognize in whatever God we worship, those aspects of God that Jesus revealed, then working backwards and around the corner, we have in fact acknowledged Jesus Christ as God's Son, God's revealer. Now that's where I think the sleight of hand, but he goes on. Second, number two, in Jesus Christ is revealed the work of God who reconciles and redeems, whose love is for all humanity. This Christ was the friend, not just of law-abiding, God-fearing insiders who proved to be his bitterest enemies at times, but also of sinful, unbelieving, or different believing outsiders. God made him to be crucified and risen Lord over all principalities and authorities, not merely Lord over the church or Lord in the hearts of Christians. Therefore, we recognize the presence and work of the God whom Christians believe was uniquely revealed in Jesus Christ, whenever and among whomever we see religion and morality with characteristics like these. Those who are ignored or rejected or befriended, those who are excluded or invited in. Love is offered without regard to race, color, creed, national origin, or physical condition. Justice is administered evenly to reconcile and restore rather than to retaliate. On the other hand, wherever and among whomever, even though they claim to be Christians, we do not see that kind of religion and morality. There we must say that the God in Christ whom Christians confess is not yet known. Third, in Jesus Christ is revealed the work of God the Spirit, the one who gives life and renews it for all humanity, whether for people of other faiths or of no faith at all. They too were created in the image of God. They too are loved and cared for by this God whose name they may not know, and for them no less than for us who know the name, Christ lived and died and was raised to reign. In them, as in Hagar, we must be prepared to discover depths of faith, personal integrity, and gratitude for the blessings of God which put us to shame. Therefore, now this is the flip side, we gratefully recognize and affirm the presence of Jesus Christ, the Spirit of God, wherever and among whomever people are set free from everything that enslaves and dehumanizes them, set free from the fears and animosities which alienate us from each other, set free from self-destructive addictions, whether to drugs or to narcissistic preoccupations with one's own health, happiness, and the accumulation of power and possessions, set free from the paralyzing despair that nothing can ever be different in one's own life or in the world, that barrenness is the only reality after all, set free to begin all over again. Now, I find Guthrie's insights to be helpful and instructive. By their fruits you shall know them is the essence of what he's saying. And who would want to dispute that? How we walk is who we are, it seems to me, is what he's saying. And yet, while his method is creative, his conclusions differ little from that inclusivism which recognizes, as it must, that God's grace is also at work among those who do not acknowledge the Lordship of Jesus Christ, enabling them to be genuinely religious and ethically responsible. So Sarah, if you could take that down now and give it back to me for a minute. Gratefully and joyfully, we affirm the faith of those outside the faith. For their faith sometimes puts our own to shame. But in the end, I'm left with this, and this is what has haunted me for years and years and years, and has not been in any way relieved by Shirley Guthrie. If there is any other way, truth, and life than what has been revealed in Jesus Christ, if there is any other name than his by which we must be saved, then the crucifixion is utterly inconsequential. The unspeakably malevolent act of a capricious God. Think about that. So now I really would love to hear from you all, because I do not consider that I have resolved anything. If you can help me, I'd appreciate it. I just can't get around the cross if one way is as good as any other, nor can I be happy about whom that would appear to exclude.
I choose to think that who's in and who's out is not my job. I am
Say
not,
again, start over.
I really don't think it's our job to say who is in and who is out. That's ultimately God's job. You know, it says in the Bible, my ways are not your ways, your ways are not my ways. It's kind of like my obligation is to believe and allow God to judge those who don't.
Well, and that's essentially the position that anybody finally has to come down to, that who's in and who's out is above our pay grade.
Yes.
But we have the Great Commission on the one hand and some very exclusive texts on the other.
Yes.
And I think we tend to just say, oh, surely, you know, God couldn't, you know, here's my son, my daughter, they're wonderful people. They love their children. They stay out of jail. Or my Jewish physician who is as observant and obedient and loves the Lord and lives by the commandments as any Christian I know, if not more so. It's a dilemma. It's a problem that I can't any longer just brush off by saying it's above my pay grade.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Doesn't the phrasing give you pause? By whom we must be saved. It's imperative. It's passive voice. We don't talk like that. Now, I love Shirley Guthrie. It was my go-to text when I had to pass ordination exams. But can't you just stop for a minute and look at that phrase, by whom we must be saved? It's passive voice. And in the New Testament, the passive voice is almost always divine passive. And the imperative, you must do this, is God's voice. So there two things have to be true in New Testament language. The doing is a divine subject, right? The doer is a divine subject. And the imperative is simply not that it's simple or easy, but that it's clear and true every time. The one who says it is so gets to say it because that's the divine one. And whatever the divine one says leaps into being. It's true before it was uttered. And so, like, maybe I'm being like really obtuse or really too, I don't know what, but it's lodged in providence. Grace is lodged in providence. So that before we were created, it was decreed that creation would be redeemed by God's own word, by the uttering of the divine one. And we have no choice in this. We have no action to perform. It is done for us, to us. We're passive. We're the recipients of the grace. Am I making any sense, or am I talking like a grammarian?
Well, I very much appreciate your linguistic analysis. I wish you'd go on. I'm still looking for the, okay, therefore, what do we do with John 14:6, for example?
Well, we don't get to say. We don't get to say. You know, like everybody's warned not to preempt God and say that we're universalist, but anybody who reads the scriptures has a sneaking suspicion that heaven and nature are going to sing on the last day. We just don't, there is just no room for a human interlocutor on the last day, save for our brother Jesus. It's not our business to open our mouths ever, except to praise God. You know, we don't get to say who's in and who's out. It's not our business. And
Well, no, nor would I ever want to do that, to say. But I'm left with what I think. You know, you've got that Matthew 25 thing too that is enough to raise the hair on the back of your neck. When did we see you hungry or sick or whatever?
you know, that's grace to me, because I pour over Carl Rahner, who talks about the anonymous Christian, and Karl Barth picks up that same thing. But to me, that's saving grace, because I don't have to understand it. I don't have to untie that Gordian knot that Karl Rahner and Karl Barth would weave for pages and pages, thousands of pages and pages. All I have to do is feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and visit the sick and imprisoned. I can do that.
Well, what of those who don't?
It's not my business. All I can do is invite them, right?
Right. Well, yeah, but you know, so far the cross is still hanging there. And what do we do with it? Why
we
the
fall flat
cross?
on our faces. We fall flat on our faces in worship.
Well, all right, but why the cross if all we have to do is feed the hungry and clothe the naked? If that alone, if walking the walk is all that is required to reestablish a right relationship with God, then why the cross? I can't get past the cross.
I guess it's no greater love. Jesus lived and was crucified to show us how to live and how to love. And I think that's why this faith business, to me, it's just a lot of mystery and miracle. And I don't think I can, or maybe many of us can really fully explain it. And I think that's part of God's plan, because he tells a story that we have in the Bible, from the old to the new, the fulfillment of the old in the new. And we have to live all that out, wrestle with the meaning of it, the truthfulness of it, despite whether it's factual or not, the meaning of all these stories that we hear. And then we live our life accordingly. And I think that's the best I can do. I wish I could explain black and white what this faith is, but belief and faith is trust in action. So we live our life with Christ, and God is our Father, and the Spirit to support us. And then I wonder why I have friends that are Unitarians, because they can believe in Jesus, but they don't believe in the miracle of the nativity or the resurrection. So they can believe in Jesus. So I just think, and I think bottom line, this wrestling keeps us connected with each other. It keeps us connected in a community of faith, to be doers, hearers of the word. And I think it's a good goal, whether you can explain and answer all these questions, but it's a goal. It's a purpose.
Well, I think you have described eloquently the Christian's life of faith, but it's a post-resurrection life that you've been describing, which backs me up to how did we get there? We've got to go past Golgotha to get to the kind of life you've described.
Yeah. And who came up with it? I like Marcus Borg. I love Marcus Borg.
Right.
So I think it was in one of his books. Okay, in order to have the resurrection, you had to start with a miracle of birth. So then you have the nativity. Or maybe it was the miracle of birth and the nativity, and then you had to balance it out with a miracle of the resurrection. Because religion is basically man-made, as Jay Wilkins said 20 years ago, and 10 years ago, and I was shocked. Man-made? I thought religion was all from God. Well, it's a combination. So,
Jay,
Jack, I don't
Jay
I don't
didn't
know.
get me. What?
I don't know if I can resolve or address you, but the way I guess I have resolved that was through a very
You will sell millions of books.
what?
was
That's-
through a theologian, my father, who didn't believe in Jesus Christ. He believed in God, and his final days in the hospital, the nurses said, "We'll have you out of here in no time," and he said, "No, I spoke with God. It's my time to go." Well, I love my father dearly. He renounced Christ because he didn't like all this meek and mild stuff. But it is my belief that he went to the pearly gates and saw Jesus and fell on his face. So even though he lived a life that was, he called himself a well-behaved heathen, my belief, my hope, my last couple of weeks ago, we talked about hope, and I am a Christian. I believe firmly it's one of the strongest qualities that I have. But on this, my father, I do have hope that he met Jesus and at the cross on his way, presumably to heaven. And he fell on his knees and worshiped him. So I like to think there is a chance for people to accept the do-gooders get to meet Jesus at a judgment. And some will fall for Christ and others won't.
Well, I would not quibble with your aspiration or your father. David H.C. Reed was for many years pastor of the Madison Avenue Presbyterian Church in New York City. And I heard him tell of a trip to Russia he took one time and was on a tour bus and got engaged in a conversation with the tour guide about Lenin. And at some point, the tour guide said to David Reed, "Lenin didn't believe in God, you know." To which David Reed replied, "He does now." So that may be the case with a number of people who don't believe, but they do now.
You know, Jack, the thing I keep coming back to is, sometimes I wonder if this going around and worrying about this, it feels like such a Western Christian thing to be worrying over. I think I've had a lot of connections with Christians that live in South Sudan, in Egypt, in the Ukraine, in Iraq. And for them, like, this doesn't feel like a conflict at all, because for them, their experience of being a faithful person, of being a Christian, has literally been an experience of life and death. And so for them, the cross is not an obstacle. It feels very visceral for them. And one of the things I've always admired and kind of been challenged by in my relationships with these folks is how, for them, the fact that they are able to reconcile this tension, it really gets down to like sharing the gospel as they've received it. I mean, because it feels like life and death, they don't see the same tension in sharing their faith with other people who don't have that faith that they do, because for them, it really is foundational. And so I think about my friend Rami, who's here from Iraq, and when he talks about whether or not Christianity is a unique and final authoritative witness, like for him, like that's a non-question. Like, why would you ask that question? Because for him, it was the difference between being alive and not being alive. And Christianity made his life much more difficult than it made it easy.
Well, I think the biblical text forces that question. I mean, it's easy enough for them to just ignore it or be casual about it or say that's nothing I worry about.
No, it's not that. It's that, like, I think sometimes we're casual about it. Because for me, being Christian is not a question of life or death for me. I'm quite comfortable, thank you very much. But for my friend Rami, having to affirm Christ meant that literally people might have killed him. I mean, he has relatives who were murdered for being Christian. And so for him, this idea that this question of whether or not the cross and what it puts in tension in terms of like the exclusive claims of Christ as the one authoritative way to life, like for him, like that decision was a life-shattering decision to make, to convert from one religion to another, to choose one way over another.
Well, I have known people seminary students from other countries who were disowned by their family.
Sure.
When they became Christians, paid a terrible price for that. But somehow I keep coming back to the fact that if it took the cross to reestablish a right relationship with God, then what?
Do you think maybe we'll see some answers in Adam's response to the Lord's direction that he sacrifice Isaac?
Oh, Abraham's?
So, yeah,
Abraham's.
Yeah.
Can we maybe find some answers in that story? I mean, this is all cultic. We sort of filter it through, Greek philosophy, but what we've really inherited is cultic in character.
Right. Well, I hadn't thought of that, but we might. That's in about 2 weeks. We'll deal with that incredibly awesome story of the sacrifice of Isaac. And I will try to make the case in that presentation that only that is finally ours to keep, which we are willing to offer up to God. But next week, we hear Sarah ask, is anything impossible for God? And detect the fact that is a question which ripples through the Old Testament and even into the New.